I would like to begin by introducing Brittany Panuccio, who many of you know well, and she's beloved by many of us in the Federalist Society because she took our friend Jesse, who a couple of years ago was a fairly intolerable curmudgeon in our organization, and she turned him into something tolerable, and we're very thankful for that. Brittany is an attorney in South Florida. She handles criminal and civil appeals. She's a former special counselor at the United States Department of Education. She also served as an attorney advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights. She detailed to the Department of Justice to work on the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh. Brittany clerked for the United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and the Fifth Circuit. She graduated from Northwestern Law School, summa cum laude, and served as notes editor for the Law Review. We are very pleased to have her here to lead this discussion today. So please join me in welcoming Brittany.
Thank you, Jason. And I have the honor of introducing our wonderful guest, Secretary DeVos. As you know, she was the Secretary of Education from 2017 to 2021 under President Trump. What you may not know is that for more than 30 years prior to her service as secretary, she led the fight for policies to allow students and parents the freedom to choose the best educational option for them. Secretary DeVos is the former chair of the American Federation for Children, the Philanthropy Roundtable, and the Michigan Republican Party. She has served on numerous boards, including the Kennedy Center and the American Enterprise Institute. Secretary DeVos is a graduate of Calvin College, and she is married to entrepreneur, philanthropist, and community activist Dick DeVos, who we are happy to have with us here today. Together, they have 4 children and 10 grandchildren. I had the privilege of working for Secretary DeVos at the Education Department, and I can say that she truly has a heart for America's children and believes that all children, regardless of their zip code or their circumstances, deserves access to a world-class education. And she has dedicated her life to making that a reality. She's the kind of leader that I always wanted to work for, principled, courageous, and truly genuine. So it's an honor to be with her on stage tonight.
Thank you, Brittany.
All right, let's start off the discussion with some background about what initially got you involved in this fight for education freedom.
Well, first of all, Brittany, thank you for that very kind introduction and for having me here today. I'm really honored to be with you all and to talk a little bit about our time at the Department of Education and the work we did there. What got me interested initially in education was being a mom and having a child starting kindergarten. Dick and I knew we were going to be able to send our children to whatever school or schools we felt was best for them because we knew we were going to be able to afford that. What happened was I discovered a wonderful little Christian school in the heart of our city that was serving the students in that immediate vicinity. And the founders of that school every year had to raise 90% of the operating funds from benefactors in the community because the families attending there could not afford the tuition. The more I got involved there, I volunteered there. Our son did not go to school there, but the more I got involved there as a volunteer, the more I realized how unjust policy was around education. That there were families, scores of families beyond the ones there that wanted to have their child at a place like this little school, the Potter's House. So that led into a whole succession of activity and efforts to ultimately change policy in Michigan and then more broadly across the country as I realized just how limited some of our opportunity was in Michigan. But it really did lead to work over 30 years, both in 501c3s and then into the political effort to actually elect folks who would support those policies. And it's been a passion for 35 years, and it has not waned one little bit.
So during those 30 years that you have been working on education at the state level, you were working to take power and control from DC and transfer it to the states, to children, to their parents. So between that work and your respect for federalism, how did that influence the way that you led as secretary of a federal agency?
Well, everything we did, as you know, Brittany, at the Department of Education, we oriented around students and what was right for students, and really returning as much power and control and decision-making to the local and state level as was permissible under law. And that was a department-wide focus of those of us who were appointed there. We had to go to battle often with those who were longtime career staff at the department to try to keep things oriented around students and families and decision-making at those levels. But everything was oriented with students in mind.
So I'd like to talk about some specific legal and policy issues, many of which you discuss in your new book, Hostages No More: The Fight for Education Freedom and the Future of the American Child. I've read the book. It is fantastic. I'm curious what inspired you to write it, and also what is the origin of the title?
Well, I never aspired to write a book, and would probably not have written a book had it not been for the pandemic and what the pandemic ultimately revealed to many more families and many more people in our country about the failings of education, of our K-12 education system. And so I felt it was a real opportunity to build on the momentum that has been created as a result of parents having a front row seat to what their children were experiencing during those months and years of the pandemic. The title Hostages No More is a direct reference to a quote made by Horace Mann. Horace Mann is commonly known as the father of our K-12 system. And approximately 175 years ago, he said that educators are entitled to look upon parents as having given hostages to our cause. And while that cause may have been laudable at that time, I'm sure it was for the most part, what parents and families have seen in the last 2-3 years up close and personal is just how many ways kids have been held hostage to a system that has been a one-size-fits-all approach for students, no matter where they come from, no matter what their interests are, and no matter how much the world around the K-12 system is changing. It has been a system that has been very resistant to change, and it hasn't been serving students well for many, many years.
Let's start with the topic of Title IX. For those who may not be familiar, Title IX is a law that bans sex discrimination, discrimination on the basis of sex, in education programs and activities that receive some form of financial assistance from the federal government. I'm curious, before we talk about the substance of it, let's talk about the process. How did your approach to reforming Title IX differ from that of President Obama and your predecessors?
Well, great question. And first of all, let me just say that Brittany and other colleagues at the department were so instrumental in the work we did around Title IX there. And I'm very grateful for all of your work personally and those of the team that really worked on the rule that we did. Our approach to Title IX, first of all, we came into office knowing that we had to do something, because the Obama administration had issued what's called a Dear Colleague letter. I'm sure most of you in this room are very familiar with that letter, with that whole process of trying to regulate by issuance of a letter that doesn't have the force of law, but they try to bully everyone into thinking it does. And so the Obama administration had issued this Dear Colleague letter, which had effectively done away with due process protections for individuals who were accused of misconduct in some fashion on a campus. And we knew coming into office we were going to have to do something with regard to the letter. We took a very methodical approach first of all, making the case why the letter needed to be rescinded and why a proper process of rulemaking had to happen. And we set it all up very, very well. We went through all of the, as Brittany knows very well, we went through every single step very meticulously and came out at the other end with a rule that has the force of law today, and one that is very balanced, that is respectful of due process, that puts the complainant in the driver's seat in terms of how the process would unfold in a matter, when there's an issue, and one that really does, I think, provide a solid framework and foundation for those who are expected to administer this particular law and rule. And it was a very long and laborious task, but I'm very, very proud of the work that was done and the resulting rule that we have that is in existence today, but under threat, and we'll probably talk about that a bit.
Indeed. Are there any provisions of this rule that you'd like to highlight as important changes that were made from the previous regime?
Well, first of all, we were very explicit about ensuring and restoring due process protections. You know, the Obama administration's Dear Colleague letter, very often those who were at the, those who were defending themselves in a matter of complaint had no access to information about what the, what was even being alleged. They were not able to ask questions of the other party, even through a third party. And very often, what happened to them resulted in a later lawsuit to correct that lack of due process, which was then not good and not right for the individual who brought the complaint. There was just total chaos. It was really a kangaroo court set up. And so our rule really restored those due process protections in a meaningful way. We made sure that whoever brought the complaint could decide how to proceed, whether to make it a formal investigation and complaint, and gave lots of ways for them to be empowered in if the matter was one more where they just wanted different accommodations made with regard to class changes or whatever. And importantly, we used the Supreme Court's definition of sexual harassment and made that a part of the rule, because there were many complaints, and Brittany, you know this as well as I do, many stories we heard from individuals who most of us in this room would just say it was a matter of expressing an opinion in a classroom that was then turned into a full-blown Title IX investigation because somebody said something that someone else didn't like. And so there were a lot of there was a lot of attention paid to protection of free speech, and importantly, part of that was gotten to through the the actual definition of what sexual harassment is.
So as you mentioned, this rule still has the force and effect of law for now. The Biden administration is also engaged in the rulemaking process. They published their proposed rule this past summer. They broke a department record, which was our previous record, for the number of comments that they received, over 240,000. So I assume they're still wading through all of those comments. And we don't know what the final rule is going to say, but based on what was in the proposed rule, what are some notable differences between the rule promulgated under your leadership and the one currently proposed?
Well, I'm very concerned about what the final rule is actually going to say, because if it's anything close to what the proposed rule is, due process protections will be totally negated again, and a single investigator model put back into place. In other words, whomever brings a complaint to a Title IX coordinator, that coordinator can be both the investigator, the judge, and the jury in that particular case. And This failed under the Obama administration's Dear Colleague letter, where over 300 different lawsuits were brought specifically around due process protections. And so I don't know what they're thinking in this area, but this is a very big cause for concern. The other area, big cause for concern is that they have proposed expanding the definition of sex to include gender identity and basically whatever any individual decides at any given point in time, which in my view will totally, and others as well, would totally negate the protections that women have in sports. And if you can have a biological male who has now claimed to be a female competing on a woman's team, it is unfair to all of those involved. And there's obviously lots of discussion about this matter more broadly today, but this is an area where they are, this administration through the Department of Education is trying to expand the definition that everyone has commonly known as a biological sex definition to basically anything that anyone wants to identify as.
With a student loan portfolio of over $1.7 billion. Trillion. I'm sorry, excuse me, $1 trillion.
I know, those 3 zeros just.
The department's Office for Federal Student Aid is essentially functioning as one of the biggest banks in the whole world. So how did we get to this point where we have this federalized system of student loans that has been projected to cost taxpayers billions of dollars?
Well, in 2010, when the debate was raging over the establishment of Obamacare, it was decided that the federal government would totally take over student lending and basically take the private markets out of student lending, ostensibly to pay for Obamacare or pay for part of it. And what has unfolded since then is a massively growing student debt total, and costs for higher education that have continued to rise at more than 3 times the rate of anything else, with the exception of some healthcare areas. And so, the federal government basically monopolized the student lending market, and the continued, the compounding of the debt has just, it's just mind-boggling. And the notion that the federal government, anywhere within the federal government, is capable of running and operating what is essentially one of the country's largest banks is inconceivable as well, many points of which we tried to make and change while in office, and to make the point that FSA as an entity should be separate and apart from the Department of Education, and governed by a nonpartisan board that has financial experience and acumen. This is a time bomb that is continuing to tick, and this administration now proposes to wipe away billions and billions of dollars in student debt, basically passing it off and pushing it on to taxpayers, people who, individuals who've paid their student loan debt, individuals, 2 out of 3 who haven't taken out student debt. And it is inconceivable that this can continue in the fashion that it's been set up and the trajectory it's been on. But I have yet to see Congress get very serious about doing something about FSA in general.
Let's talk more about the Biden administration's loan cancellation program that you just mentioned. The administration is attempting to cancel about $430 billion of student loan debt. And there are 2 consolidated cases in the Supreme Court. They're about to be argued later this month. And I noticed that you and 4 other former secretaries of education recently filed an amicus brief in that case, discussing whether the secretary actually has the legal authority to do mass cancellations of debt. So I was hoping you could tell us what your position is in that amicus brief.
Absolutely. Well, and this is a brief that was just filed yesterday for the case that comes up before the court at the end of this month, Nebraska versus Biden. And the point that we have made, and it's former Secretary Bill Bennett, Rod Page, Margaret Spellings, and Lamar Alexander, and myself. And the point we're making is the Secretary of Education has no authority to cancel student debt. And the only narrow possibility for cancellation of student debt is essentially individuals on a case-by-case basis under the HEROES Act, which was passed in conjunction with September 11, 2001, specifically for members of the military. And yet the Biden administration is just basically shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, we don't really care if there's legal standing or grounds for us to do this. We're going to do it anyway. But I'm very hopeful that the court will do what many of us think is the obvious thing and shut this down, because it is patently unfair to millions and millions of Americans. Not to mention, it's just bad policy. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't change anything, and it would set up a terrible precedent.
Continuing with this theme of money, let's talk about the influence of foreign money in higher education. Section 117 of the Higher Education Act requires colleges and universities to twice a year report gifts that accumulate to $250,000 or more that they receive from foreign sources. I'm hoping you can first tell us why this is such an important statute to enforce, and also how you work to get compliance from the sometimes reticent schools of Section 117.
Sure. Well, this was a fairly obscure law that has had for many years really gone unhighlighted. There were very few schools that were voluntarily reporting regularly if they did and from whom they received these foreign gifts or contributions or investments, as they often called them. And so we know, or we knew, that this would be an area, more broadly speaking, a national security issue area, because not surprisingly, many of these contributions are going to institutions that just happen to have a research component to them, and many of them with contracts with the Department of Defense. And so and this law has been on the books for about 50 years. So it's not like a new thing that just was introduced in this last administration. We made inquiries or opened investigations into 12 different institutions, and just with those 12 institutions alone, over $6.5 billion of unreported foreign funding was identified. And so we know it was just sort of the tip of the iceberg. We set up a very simple reporting system that they could, easily comply with twice a year as the law required. But many of them resisted. And not surprisingly, the Biden administration basically put an end to the program when they came into office. And it is a matter of grave concern when you look at the fact that at University of Pennsylvania, for example, the Biden Center, which was opened up in 2017, and that many have called a Department of State in waiting for the current Biden administration. Anthony Blinken, our current Secretary of State, was director of the Biden Center, 2017 to 2019. And interestingly, as a result of our inquiry around Section 117, about $60 million was revealed to have come into the University of Pennsylvania just in those years, 2017 to 2020. Now, getting, gifts and investments from foreign sources is not illegal. But what is not legal is to not do your duty and report these things. And so I'm very disappointed and am concerned about the fact that this current administration just does not see fit to insist that we have transparency and accountability around this issue, because it's again, I think, more broadly, an important national security issue.
Let's shift gears and talk about the pandemic. And I know you alluded to this earlier when discussing the inspiration for writing your book. I'm hoping you can describe some of the positive and negative effects that we have seen on students as a result of the pandemic.
Well, the pandemic had devastating effects on students, particularly those in their K-12 years, academically, social, emotionally, and I would say the same is true for students in higher education. But the fact that many kids, millions of kids, were shut out of their schools for months and months and months on end, the learning losses, we've only begun to understand the impact of those months and months of shutdown, of distance learning that really was not adequate in any sense of the word. And so on that side of the equation, this is, it's going to be known as I think, Generation COVID, because I think we're going to see the impacts on, more broadly on our country in the longer term. On the flip side of that, I would say the silver lining to the pandemic is that it has revealed the many, many failings of a system that has long failed millions of kids. And this was made clear to families who thought their children were in a school that they had chosen for them, whether it was an area they've moved to, or in some cases, tuition they were paying. It brought up front the lack of rigor in many cases, the total lack of trying to meet the needs of students during an uncertain time, or in many other cases, the astonishment that many families, many parents had when seeing some of the curriculum that their children were being subjected to. And so whether it's on, hypersexualization for young children, critical race theories, you name it, there were a range of curricular issues that really brought into focus the lack of control that families have had, the lack of full knowledge of what's been taking place in schools. And so it has awakened families in ways that I don't think would not have happened absent the pandemic and its consequences there. What that has done is set in motion a lot of momentum around policy change that I've long been advocating, and states that are really making moves in this direction. And I'm happy to keep going on that, but you may have more questions around specifically some of the things that are happening.
Yeah, I'm hoping you can talk more about Florida in particular, especially during the pandemic. Florida has been recognized as a beacon of freedom. And so I'm curious what your view is on the state of education freedom in Florida as compared to other states.
Well, I've always called out Florida as being the leader in education freedom, going back to when Jeb Bush was governor and was successful with the legislature then in passing the first statewide private education freedom or school choice program. And then Florida's continued to build on that since that really important moment. Florida has been first in the country right up until Arizona just passed a statewide education savings account a couple of months ago. Now, I think Florida's not going to be very far behind, because the legislature is right now considering a universal education savings account bill, which I think will be transformational. Again, continue the transformation that Florida has begun, but it will be especially so because I think education savings accounts are the key to really unlocking and unleashing the creativity and the potential around how kids can experience, or the options kids will have to experience their K-12 learning. Again, think about the fact that we are still operating essentially across the board, whether you're in a charter school, a private school, or a traditional public school, or any other iteration. We are essentially operating with the same kind of approach to K-12 education that was begun 175 years ago when Horace Mann and all of his colleagues set up a system that was meant for an industrial age and industrial revolution, where kids would go in the front end, all learn the same thing, and come out the back end ready for factory jobs that were going to continue to that didn't have the same kind of requirements that we have today around knowledge and ability to think creatively and differently about how to solve some of these issues. I think the unleashing of that creativity to meet the needs of students individually and giving parents the power to customize their children's education is going to fundamentally change how K-12 education actually happens. Not immediately, but in the next several years, we're going to start to see a lot of different kinds of approaches and experiences for kids to learn than we've ever dreamt of before.
What is your proudest accomplishment from your time as secretary?
I would say orienting around the notion that education should be about kids, not about systems and adults and infrastructure, and raising up this idea of education freedom where you fund students rather than the systems. I don't think we would be at the same place we are today nationally around this conversation and state by state if we had not brought that kind of focus to that issue then. And I would say secondarily, the work that we did on the Title IX rulemaking and bringing fairness and balance and a reliable approach back to that, and giving students, particularly at the college level, a good, in the event of those situations, a good and solid place to land versus what they had before.
Is there anything in particular that you wished you could have accomplished if you had more time?
Yeah, I wished we had been able to get the federal tax credit to support education freedom, school choice in the states. I wished we'd been able to get that accomplished because it didn't happen during the first 2 years. There's no way it was going to happen the second 2 years when the Democrats took the House. But again, building the support. So today, a very similar piece of legislation to what we had proposed has been introduced, and the support continues to build for that. Speaker McCarthy has carved out in the Parents' Bill of Rights that they're championing this support for a federal tax credit. I do think that introducing education freedom at every level, not creating a new bureaucracy or a new department at the federal level, but merely a mechanism for individuals to redirect a little bit of their federal tax bill to come alongside what states are doing. So Floridians could, direct through a federal tax credit a little bit of their federal tax bill directly into helping kids here in Florida find their fit for education. And I think that's a really important area.
Now, before I ask my final question or two, we are going to have a brief Q&A period. So at this time or in the next minute or so, if you do have a question, you can start lining up at one of the two microphones there. In the meantime, Secretary, I'm hoping that you can share with us an anecdote from your time serving as secretary, something behind the scenes that people wouldn't necessarily know about policy from reading in the newspaper.
Sure, a couple things come to mind. When I went to work in Washington, it was with the full expectation that and knowledge that entering a federal agency was going to be difficult just because of the inherent bureaucracy and tendency of a large government organization. I underestimated how difficult the bureaucracy could be. And within the first week in office, I recall there was the reception area to the secretary's sort of area of offices, and that included all of the support staff for the secretary, the deputy secretary, our policy people, our chief, my chief of staff and deputies, quite a few people. But there's a receiving area. And there were two individuals who were career staff people, civil servants that staffed the reception desk. And on this particular Friday, my deputy chief of staff went in to ask them a question about some process, something, and found the desk empty. So she inquired around a little bit of the person managing those individuals, and the answer was, well, on Fridays they telework. Think about that. Their job is to receive people, and they're teleworking. It was just emblematic of all kinds of things that in the private sector it would not stand, it would not happen. So that was one thing. And I have one other I could share about my one and only encounter with our current president. Would anyone like to hear that? Yeah, this was quite something. I had never met Joe Biden, and in December 30, I think it was December 30, 2018, I broke my pelvis in a bike accident. And I was in a wheelchair for 2 months. The very first day that I was out to speak publicly again, I was still in the wheelchair. And it was at the National Council of Mayors convention in Washington. And after my speech, my personal assistant, Sarah, who, first of all, this was kind of funny. They had constructed a ramp at the very last minute because I could not get up onto this high stage without the wheelchair and the ramp. And it was definitely not the ADA level. It was like a 45 degree or more. So she's muscling me up there, and then on the way down, I suggested that she turn around because if we went down forward, we would be a runaway train. But all that to say, the setup, back in the room behind, that you go back behind the curtains at places like this, and I was back there with the rest of my staff that had been there with me, and we were waiting for the freight elevator to take us down. And I knew that Biden was speaking right after me, but he wasn't anywhere back there. Some of his staff clearly were. All of a sudden, out of this back room, this man comes bustling out, and I recognized him to be Joe Biden. And he came up to me like I was a very long-lost friend, which I was not because I had never met him. And he zeroed in, and I kid you not, stuck his forehead on my forehead and asked me how I was doing. It was a terrifying moment. It was.
Well, on that note, we will start with our audience questions here. Why don't we start with you, Jordan?
Thanks, Brittany. Thank you, Secretary DeVos, for all your perseverance under all the attacks you got when you were serving. I have a question about the education savings accounts, and this has come up with other school choice things. And how do you respond to the notion that they don't offer enough money to get poor people into private schools, and that the private schools will not take children with various disabilities, and they're all going to get dumped into the public schools, and so this is just a subsidy for middle class and rich people?
This is the argument we hear, like, in some version everywhere all the time. The reality is that where education savings accounts have been introduced and or other forms of school choice, families find options and find opportunities. Most schools that exist today, they will. Well, let's go to the Arizona example. Every student there is going to be able to take 90% of what the state spends on that child today and use it for educational services, however their family puts it together to get that child's education. Interestingly, what has been happening in Arizona through the pandemic is you had a lot of families, even many urban poor families, out of necessity say, we can't do this anymore. We're going to take our children, and we're going to start our own little school. And they basically put together a one-room schoolhouse, 21st century version, hired a great teacher who was tired of being shut out of his or her classroom, and it's really working for them now. Those kinds of opportunities are going to only grow. Also, most of the schools, most of these programs, the amount of support through the Education Choice Initiative is very close to what most private, small, independent, faith-based schools charge. And many of them will make up programs, or they'll make up the difference through scholarship programs they have internally. Mm-hmm. Also, I think the longer-term reality is the more education freedom you have, with more families with the buying power, the more you're going to see variety in what the costs really are. And you're going to see, the cost of accessing some of these things continue to go down. With regard to students with special needs or disabilities, again, that has been the allegation that opposition will make regularly. Again, the reality is that most families that have looked for something different for their child with a special need or a disability have found a great solution. And I think about my friend Tara Meyer in Ohio, who I think was single-handedly responsible for getting the Ohio Special Needs Voucher passed there. She, for her son Samuel, who has Down syndrome, found just the perfect setting for him once that legislation got passed. And in the state of Florida also, for example, the special needs bills here support families with students that need that additional support at a higher level monetarily. And that is true in most places where there are special needs education or school choice programs. There's a recognition that the costs for some of the therapies and the education for these kids is higher, and the state is generally spending multiple times higher for those children. So those issues really and those arguments don't pan out in reality, and I think, again, with more and more freedom, it's going to become even more of a moot point.
Thank you.
We have a question over here.
If you don't mind me moving the microphone so that I can see you. Madam Secretary, thank you for all the work that you've done, both as Secretary of Education as well as before and after on education freedom. And the question I would have for you is, hasn't the experience in the Netherlands to where vouchers are given to every parent, they can spend that money however they wish, public school, private school, faith-based school, not faith-based school, a faith of their own choosing, a faith of no faith at all. Hasn't that proven the effectiveness of what you have been proposing, both in terms of their students having less money spent per student and achieving a much greater result than we do in the United States?
That's a great example of where choice has worked for many, many, many years. And I actually had the opportunity to travel there during time in office to meet with and talk with and visit some of the schools that parents were choosing. And it is true that the Netherlands continues to outperform the United States in every measure and every metric under the PISA, the international assessment of achievement. So pre-pandemic, America's scores were, as I recall, 13th in reading, 18th in science, and 37th in math. And yet we spend nearly 40% more than almost every other country in the world. And the Netherlands is a great example. They spend far less per pupil, and yet their achievement levels have been, I believe, top 10 in every subject area, maybe even top 5 in a couple of them.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question over here.
Good afternoon. Eric Reichenberger. Thank you, Secretary DeVos, also for your work in Michigan as a fellow Michigander, born and raised there and moved to Florida about 17 years ago. I appreciate and have seen all your efforts in Michigan as I was growing up. I wanted to ask you, in light of, I attended the University of Michigan, and as you know, not a bastion of conservatism.
Correct.
And knowing the ideological indoctrination that occurs in higher education, especially across the country, and in a lot of these state universities, Governor DeSantis introduced a plan just in the past few days to sort of root out the indoctrination that's going on in state universities here in Florida. And I'm wondering to what extent you see that occurring elsewhere in the United States, and what efforts you've made or you see on the horizon.
Well, Governor DeSantis has been leading in many of these areas. And if there's one thing I know about governors, they tend to be pretty competitive. And so I guarantee you there are other governors looking at what DeSantis is doing here and taking note. I'm hopeful that others will follow suit and really, especially, public institutions that are receiving state taxpayer money, not supporting and not permitting to be part of their budgetary process some of these issues that are really non-core to education, and in many cases are really antithetical to anything to do with our nation's founding. I think that he's certainly setting a great example in that regard. And as it relates to the University of Michigan, I think the last count there were more DEI consultants and advisors at the University of Michigan than there were history professors. And so one has to ask where the priorities are at institutions like that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for your questions. And thank you to Secretary DeVos.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.